Hi, Mark Ranis here with Lecture 8.1 on compound propositions. This corresponds with Section 8.1 of our text, The Reasonable Person, and it's the first section in Chapter 8. Today, we'll go through a little bit of an introduction to Chapter 8, the overall topic of which is compound syllogisms, and then we'll turn to our topic for today, which is compound propositions in Section 8.1. We're moving beyond the categorical proposition, and so we'll describe exactly how, namely by adding propositions, more of them, but also in logical relation to each other. And we'll talk about how that allows us to mix things that we don't know or things that haven't been determined yet with things that we do know and maybe use logic in circumstances that require a more complicated or nuanced understanding of reality. We'll end up by talking about how we use letters for propositions with this part of our text, and not simply for terms, a different notational system. So let's get started. All right, if you look back at what we've done in the last 3 chapters, we've basically been progressing from an understanding of propositions to an understanding of arguments. In Chapter 5, we learned about what a categorical proposition was. We learned about it having only one subject and one predicate. And then we learned about how we use quantity and quality to come up with different versions of that. In Chapter 6, we learned about how to understand truth values of different categorical propositions by knowing what other truth values were on the square of opposition. We learned about equivalent statements as well. So that by that we managed to talk about some immediate inferences. Then in Chapter 7, we use those categorical propositions to construct arguments that we know as categorical syllogisms. Categorical syllogisms because they're composed of categorical propositions. Now in this chapter, we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it all in one chapter. That is, we're going to learn ultimately about compound syllogisms, but we're going to learn that by starting with the compound proposition, because the compound proposition is what makes a compound syllogism rather than a categorical syllogism. So, as before, we're going to start with the nature of the new propositions that we're introducing, that is the compound propositions, and then work our way up to understanding the arguments, the syllogisms that we construct with these new propositions. All right, so how are we going beyond the categorical proposition? What are we doing now that's different? Well, categorical propositions have only one subject and only one predicate, right? That's what makes them categorical. It's variations in quantity and quality that give us the 4 types, and that's that 2x2 matrix that became so familiar in chapters 5 and 6. There are 4 different kinds of statements that we get, the A, E, I, and O. So when we say that all men are mortal, we're using a proposition that is both universal and affirmative, right? So it comes to A. Universal is the top row. The affirmative is the left-hand column. If we say no cheaters are winners, that's universal and negative. Upper right, that's E. If we say some lawyers are crooks, that's particular and affirmative. That's the lower left, it's I. And if we say some lawyers are not crooks, that is particular and negative, that is the lower right, and we call that an O proposition. Now sometimes A, E, I, and O don't really do the job very well in describing what we want to describe. Sometimes we want to say something that's more complicated. And certainly A, E, I, and O do not exhaust the number of statements that we want to make about the world. Sometimes we might want to say something like, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. Or, you can pay me now or pay me later. Or, you can't have your cake and eat it too. These are things that we could possibly say with using the A, E, I, or O format, but it's not the most natural way to say it. It's not the way people in fact say it. They use forms that are much closer to what we mean by a compound proposition. And here's our formal definition of a compound proposition. It's a proposition that comprises, that word means includes, 2 or more different categorical propositions in some logical relation to each other. Right? Compound proposition, one that comprises 2 or more different categorical propositions in some logical relation to each other. So just like the word cowboy, is a compound word because it has the word cow and the word boy in it. Compound propositions are propositions that have two or more different categorical propositions inside them, and those are in some logical relation to each other. More on that right now. So the first thing we're doing is using two or more categorical propositions. We're adding content, we're adding substance to the compound proposition, making it more complicated than we could easily represent in a categorical proposition. For example, where there's smoke, there's fire addresses the existence of smoke and the existence of fire. There's two different topics here. And when you say you can pay me now or pay me later, it addresses two different potential times for payment. You can make all of that one thing and make a very awkward A statement out of it, or but that isn't what the way. It's not the best way to think about it. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Well, that addresses the ability to eat a cake and the ability to have a cake left. So in all these cases, we're not simply squishing together two categorical propositions and putting an and between them or something like that. But we are predicating two different things, right? The assertion that is being made here, in terms of its substance, the assertion covers two different possibilities or two different events or two different pieces of information. That's the sense in which we are adding together categorical propositions to make them compound. But that's not all we're doing. The compound proposition doesn't just add categorical propositions, it also places them in logical relation. So, for example, the relationship might be an if-then relationship. If some proposition, then some other proposition follows. That's called conditional. And you can see that where there's smoke, there's fire is essentially a conditional proposition. We're saying if there's smoke, then there's a fire somewhere that created that smoke. That is an if-then statement, and we can just focus on the if-then and use the dots to leave out the rest of it for now. Another type would be the either-or proposition, which we call disjunctive because it disjoins two things, either one or the other. You can pay me now or pay me later addresses these. That is a statement best expressed in disjunctive form because it says, I don't care when you pay me, but it has to be once, one or the other, right? The you can't have your cake and eat it too is a classic example of a conjunctive proposition because it includes both possibilities. Now, usually when we use conjunctive propositions in logic, we are, at least for conjunctive syllogisms, they're almost always negated. So you will usually see this one with a not at the beginning, not both one thing and another. That is how we usually use conjunctive propositions. I hope you can see from these examples that the logical relation is actually the primary point asserted by the compound proposition. So if I say, for example, that if there is smoke, there must be fire someplace, I'm not asserting that there is smoke. I'm not asserting that there is fire. I'm not asserting that there's not smoke or not fire. None of that is the main point. What I'm actually asserting is that there is a conditional relationship between the existence of smoke and the existence of fire. I'm saying, for example, that that the only way to get smoke is through fire, right? So if there's smoke, there must be a fire someplace. That's the interesting part of what's being said. If I said, where there's smoke, there's fire, and you said, I don't smell anything, that really wouldn't be responsive to what I said because what I'm saying is about a causal relationship between the two. And it's not causal right away. It's eventually a causal relationship, but it is at first blush just a logical relationship that one thing must follow from the other. And it's the same with the other types of compound proposition. Whenever we make one of these statements, what we are primarily saying is that the relationship between these two is a certain type of relationship. We say that even before we get to looking at whether the underlying categorical parts, the parts that are in the dots here, are true. What this allows us to do is to incorporate uncertainty or indeterminateness into our logical analysis. Because each time that we assert one of these logical relationships, we're typically pointing toward some area of uncertainty, and it might be uncertain because we don't know yet or we lack knowledge, or it might be uncertain because it depends on human choice, or it might depend on an accident of the weather. Who knows? There's something that's uncertain, but there's something that we know regardless of the uncertainty. And that's really what we're trying to mix together here. There may or may not be smoke, but if there's smoke, then there's fire. That gives us some basis for viewing the situation, even though there might be something that's uncertain about it. You don't have to pay me now. You don't have to pay me later. But you do have to pay me either now or later. You can have your cake indefinitely, or you can eat your cake now. That's your choice. I'm not saying anything about that, but you can't do both. It is a matter of logical necessity that if you do one of those, it excludes the other one. That's what the assertion is saying. So this incorporates what we don't know with what we do know. And we can extend this to when we're trying to describe what something is, right? We may not know what something is, but we might know that it's got to be one thing or another. It could be this, it could be that. Not sure which. Or we might know that it certainly can't be two things at once. It can't be both of two things that are incompatible with each other. So we proceed in our knowledge. We learn more by using those other logical forms. Similarly, we might not know whether something is true, but we might know what consequences must follow if it is true. In fact, the if-then statement often helps us figure out what we need to investigate further in order to get another perspective on the thing that we still don't know. So that's how we mix what we do know with what we don't know by using compound propositions. Now there's a notational issue here, which is that now we're going to use letters, including the letter P, which we've already used quite a bit. We're going to use that for a different purpose. We're still doing formal logic, right? So we want to use notation here that will emphasize formal similarity, regardless of what the substance or the matter of any proposition happens to be. So here are a couple of examples. If it's Sunday, then Chick-fil-A is closed is formally exactly the same as if it rains, the campers at the bottom of the hill will get wet. When I say they're formally the same, what I mean is we can write both of them in the form if P, then Q, where P and Q are going to stand for entire categorical propositions rather than terms. So, for example, P could equal it is Sunday, or P could equal it will rain. And Q could equal Chick-fil-A is closed, or Q could equal the campers at the bottom of the hill will get wet. In the first example I gave, if it's Sunday, then Chick-fil-A is closed. That is the first of those two alternatives I gave you. P is it is Sunday. If P, then Q, Chick-fil-A is closed. Or in the second example, if it rains, P, then Q, the campers at the bottom of the hill will get wet. Whether P is true or whether Q is true, I can't say. But the assertion here is that if P is true, then Q must be true. So what we've just gone through is an example of a conditional proposition, and we can give the definition here for a conditional proposition. It is a compound proposition in which two categorical propositions are joined in an if-then statement. So our definition of compound proposition said that it was a proposition that comprises two categorical propositions in some kind of logical relationship. What makes it conditional is that we've specified which kind of logical relationship it is. It is the if-then relationship that makes it conditional, and it's one of the three that we'll cover in this chapter. And therefore, we now know what a compound syllogism is. It is, first and foremost, a syllogism. That is, it's a three-line argument in which the conclusion purports to follow from two premises. It's one of those. But it's a syllogism in which the major premise is a compound proposition. The minor premise might be compound, it might be categorical. But it's a syllogism, so there's a conclusion which purports to follow from the first two premises. But what sets the compound syllogism apart is that the first premise, the major premise, is a compound proposition rather than a categorical proposition. The second premise, could be compound, could be categorical, don't know. The conclusion, could be compound, could be categorical, don't know. But what makes this compound is that the first premise, at least, is compound rather than categorical. So that takes care of the vocabulary that we need to get through this chapter, and that'll do it for today. I'll be back next time with section 8.2 on the conditional syllogism.